Hi, I'm Chef Brad, America's Grain Guy, cooking in the Honeyville kitchen today. And today we're going to show you how to make bread by hand. I love making bread. Actually, it's my favorite pastime. I would rather make bread than do just about anything in the world. It's absolutely a wonderful thing. But before we start the bread, one of my favorite combinations is beans and bread. So we're gonna quickly throw on a pot of beans in our pressure cooker. By the time the bread is done, the beans will be done and we have the perfect meal. Nothing like a slice of homemade bread with beans poured over the top of it and a big chunk of butter. Doesn't that sound great? We have our pressure cooker already turned on. I have my Anasazi beans here. These are kind of, in my house, we call them the Sunday bean. They're tender and delicious, and they cook in about 30 minutes. So we're gonna dump our beans in there. We have 3 cups of water, a little bit of salt, and a little bit of oil. We're gonna put the lid on and forget about it. And now we're gonna have some fun and make a batch of homemade bread by hand. One of my favorite tools is a Danish dough hook. This is, I think, essential when you're making bread by hand, because the hardest part is that first part when you're mixing everything together. And I hate putting my hands in it. They get all doughy and gooey. That drives me crazy. So I love this tool right here. So we have all of our ingredients. The first thing is some hot water. We'll put our hot water in, and then we're gonna put in our sugar, oil, and any oil works, whatever you want to use, a little bit of salt, and then we're gonna add about half of our flour. So I have 3 cups of liquid, so I know it's gonna take about 8 or 9 cups of flour. So I'm gonna put in 4 cups of flour to start with. So we're gonna put our flour in, and the flour we're using today is the Alta Artisan flour from Honeyville. It's my favorite bread flour ever. The reason I love this flour is the end result is perfect, but it's a chemical-free flour. No bromines, no chemicals, so the end result is gonna be fabulous because you're not fighting the chemicals to get a good bread. Now, the very last thing we put in here is our yeast. I always put it on top of the flour, just in case my water's a little bit too hot, I'm not gonna kill the yeast. So there's my yeast on the top, and now I'm gonna take my handy little Danish dough hook, and we're just gonna mix this up. And we want kind of a sloppy mixture here. We're gonna go from here and then we're gonna dump it out on the counter and knead it. So once I get a sloppy, shaggy mix here, and that just takes about a minute to do. Okay, so this is kind of wet and sloppy. So we're gonna take this, and look how the dough just goes right through this dough hook. It's pretty cool. So now we're gonna set this aside, and we're gonna put some flour right on the counter. And we're gonna spread this out. And then we're gonna take our dough, and we're gonna dump it right on the top of this. We're gonna take the dough out, and this hook works really good again. Just scrape that right out onto there. Okay, there we go. Now, we're gonna put a little bit more flour on the top. A little bit of flour on the top, and now the fun begins, the kneading of the dough. We're gonna take our hands and just flip it under the bottom. And the first part about it is just kind of incorporating a little bit of flour into it to where it's not really sticky. So we're just gonna fold it over a couple times until we know it's not gonna be too sticky to work with. Okay, and the thing about making bread by hand, I'm using all white flour today, and I'd recommend if you're gonna do it by hand, start out using all white flour and a good white flour. And then if you wanna add grains to it, you can add a little bit of grains to it, but really when you're doing it by hand, you're gonna have a better loaf of bread because the gluten works up a lot quicker in a white flour. And if you're using a good white flour, it's even gonna be better. So now we have it to where it's not really sticky like it was, and we're gonna start the kneading process. The kneading process is pretty simple. You pull towards you, and then with the balls of your hand, you push away from you, and then you turn it. And then you pull towards you, with the balls of your hand, you push away, and then you turn it. And you just keep doing that. Pull, press, turn. Pull, press, turn. Pull, press, turn. Is that easy? It's very simple. Now, why are we kneading the bread like this? This is what gets the gluten worked up and gives that bread the elasticity it needs. Now, I love modern day machines like the Bosch mixer. It's a great mixer to mix breads in. But nothing can take away from that experience of doing it by hand. And I personally think that everyone should learn to do it by hand first. Your granddaughters, your sons, your daughters, what a great thing to teach them first, because you know, they might go away to school and they don't have a mixer. So to do it by hand, what a great thing to learn. And it's a relaxing process. And you know, the end result is gonna be so much better when you do it by hand. Maybe it's just all the love you're putting in it as you're kneading. So see how I'm doing that? I'm just turning, pressing, and that same continuous method. If it starts to get a little sticky, just take a little bit of flour, sprinkle over the top of it. And this is gonna need probably about 4 or 5 minutes you're gonna knead it. And you're gonna knead until you get a nice elastic feel to the bread. And then you're gonna put it in a bowl with a little bit of oil and let it rise until it's double. Punch it down, let it rise until it's double again. Punch it down, form your loaves in a loaf pan, let it rise, and then bake it. And in about 2 hours, you're gonna have the most beautiful bread or rolls or whatever you decide to do out of the oven, and you're gonna feel so good about what you've done. So after the kneading, you want your dough to look like this, silky and smooth and beautiful. The next step is putting a little bit of oil in your bowl, and then taking the dough, the top part down in the oil that down, and then turn it over, put it in the bowl. The reason you put oil on it is to keep it from drying out. Cover it with a cloth to keep the warm air in there, and it's gonna take about 15 to 20 minutes for the first rise, and then another 15 to 20 minutes for the second rise, and then we're gonna take it out and form it into cinnamon rolls or whatever we're gonna do. So we'll be back in just a moment to show you that part. We've let our dough rise twice, meaning we've let it rise, we punched it down, and we let it rise again. That develops the gluten and gives you that wonderful, beautiful texture. So look at our dough. Isn't that beautiful? It's almost like liquid silk. It's absolutely beautiful. So now we're gonna put this on the counter and we're gonna form a couple loaves. My favorite loaf pans, I have two. I love this pan right here. It holds 2 pounds of dough. I weigh my dough to put it in there, so I always have a consistent loaf of bread. 2 pounds of dough will give you a loaf of bread that looks like that. And this loaf was baked in this pan. And then my other favorite pan is this small little pan. These are great. This will hold 10 ounces of dough. So I weigh the dough, and then my end loaf looks like that. Isn't that great? This is my giveaway loaf. When I can bake a big batch of bread and make a bunch of these, and it'll go a lot further than a couple of those. This is a great little pan to have. So now we're just gonna take the dough, and I don't put flour back on the counter because I don't wanna dry it. Just a little bit of oil, and the bread was nice and oily. So then we're just gonna divide this into our loaves. And we want about 2 pounds. Now, normally I use a scale. A kitchen scale is really handy to use if you want to get the right amount. So I just take my dough, and you want to force some of that air out of it. So I just kind of fold it in, lift it up, smack it on the counter. That works the air out of it. And make sure it's nice and smooth. A little bit more air bubbles in there we want to work out. And then we take this, when it's nice and smooth, and we're gonna put this into the loaf pan, right like this. And then we're gonna let that rise until it's double, and then we're gonna bake it in our oven. And baking instructions will be on the recipe. Another thing you can do with this dough is, my favorite is, who doesn't love a homemade cinnamon roll? These are great, and these have a fabulous buttermilk caramel topping on them. They're just gonna be great. Well, remember, right before we start our dough, we put a pot of beans in. Let's take a look at these beans. These are the Anasazi beans. And I threw in some of that wonderful freeze-dried ham on the top of them and let it cook for another 6 minutes, so we have this beautiful dish. And remember, my favorite meal ever is a slice of bread. Notice the butter on there. It's gonna melt with the beans on there. You're gonna put the beans on there, get some of that sauce out of there. Oh my goodness, this is pure comfort food at its best. It doesn't get any better than homemade bread made with that Artisan white flour, Anasazi beans with some of the freeze-dried ham in there. perfect. Oh, absolutely heaven on a plate. It's been great fun cooking with you today in the Honeyville kitchen. For more information about our wonderful products, tips on how to use them, and the recipes, go to honeyville.com.